With the historic Normandy landing successfully accomplished, the Allies took stock of their situation. On June 7th, D-Day +1, General Eisenhower and Admiral Ramsey, his naval commander-in-chief, inspected the landing beaches with an eye to the problem of landing the large additional forces needed for the big drive against Hitler's army.
It was necessary to provide a means for sheltering beach supply from the effect of storms. To solve this problem, we undertook to construct artificial harbors on the coast of Normandy. One type of protected anchorage, named Mulberry, was practically a complete harbor. The principal construction unit in the Mulberry was an enormous concrete ship called a Phoenix, box-like in shape, and so heavily constructed that when numbers of them were sunk end to end along a strip of the coast, they would probably provide solid protection against almost any wave action. Elaborate auxiliary equipment to facilitate unloading and all types of gear required in the operation of a modern port were planned for and provided. The British and American sectors each had one of the Mulberry ports. Here, ships and landing craft could continue to unload in any except the most vicious weather. We had simultaneously to build up on the beaches the reserves in troops, ammunition, and supplies that would enable us within a reasonable time to initiate deep offensives with the certainty that these could be sustained through an extended period of decisive action.
As in every campaign in World War II, one of the first orders of business following the invasion was the quick construction of airfields from which to support the advance of the ground forces. Experienced construction units built new airfields on the continent as fast as they were called for. In each case, the strips were in use a miraculously short time after the men started work. The results of their efficiency were readily felt, especially by the enemy. Less than a week after the assault troops had stormed ashore on the Normandy beaches, the Supreme Commander of Allied forces was the host for a tour of inspection of the area by several unexpected visitors from Washington.
I arranged to take General Marshall, Admiral King, General Arnold, and a group from their respective staffs into the Beachhead during the day of June 12th. Their presence, as they roamed around the areas with every indication of keen satisfaction, was heartening to the troops. The importance of such visits by the High Command can scarcely be overestimated in terms of their value to soldiers' morale. On that same day, June 12, 1944, the first flying bomb, known as V-1, reached London. The V-1 was a small, pilotless airplane which flew at high speed on a predetermined course and terminated its flight by means of settings in its mechanism. It contained a large amount of explosive which detonated upon contact, and the blast effect was terrific. The depressing effect of the bombs was not confined to the civilian population. Soldiers at the front began again to worry about friends and loved ones at home, and many American soldiers asked me whether I could give them any news about particular towns in southern England. The effect of the new weapons was very noticeable upon morale.
All anti-aircraft crews in the area tried to hit them in flight with some success. Every means at hand was used to try to explode them before they landed. In Germany, construction was being rushed on newer, more devastating weapons. In the final stages of its experimental phase, the V-2 rocket bomb was being readied for use against England. In early tests, many V-2s turned out to be failures. But after 2 years of experimentation, the rockets were performing well enough for leading German engineers to persuade Hitler that their use in large numbers against England would achieve wholesale destruction. The first non-experimental launching was set for late summer.
On June 19th, the hurricane struck us. It stopped for a period of 4 days nearly all landing activity on the beaches and therefore interfered seriously with every operation. During that time, sea communications between the United Kingdom and the continent were completely interrupted. On the day of the storm's ending, I counted more than 300 wrecked vessels above small boat size, some so badly damaged they could not be salvaged. There was no sight in the war that so impressed me with the industrial might of America as the wreckage on the landing beaches. To any other nation, the disaster would have been almost decisive. But so great was America's productive capacity that the great storm occasioned little more than a ripple in the development of our buildup. General Bradley had predicted that the capture of Cherbourg was going to be a rather nasty job and counted on speed and boldness as much as upon the strength of his assaulting forces to gain an early decision in that area. His estimate was 10 days if we are lucky, 30 if we are not.
The capture of Cherbourg, a major port, was a matter of immediate importance. American GIs of the 7th Corps assigned to the job expected stiff resistance from the defending Nazi garrison. Before our big guns went into action to soften up the German positions, American Cub planes again proved invaluable in spotting enemy strong points. Once their positions were spotted, our attack got going without delay.
Fire!
Cherbourg itself was strongly defended. But by June 25th, the first American troops forced their way into the city after a vicious battle and paved the way for the final capture. But first, the GIs had a last remnant of the Nazi garrison to silence. GIs had to finish them off, one by one. Cherbourg finally fell on June 27th, just 3 weeks after D-Day. The area yielded some 39,000 Nazi prisoners, most of whom had fought stubbornly until confronted by American infantry patrols. These Nazis seemed surprised indeed to find themselves in Allied hands, and especially in such a short time. Their grandiose dreams of victory had never ended in such a humiliating spectacle. After several days, there were few reminders of the Nazi occupation. To the citizens of Cherbourg, life began again. The Nazis, in their customary fashion, had succeeded in pretty thoroughly wrecking Cherbourg. But the Allies now controlled a major port, which would enable them to deliver large quantities of supplies to the troops much more quickly. General Eisenhower was greatly pleased with the performance of the troops under Generals Bradley and Lieutenant Joe Cullen on the western flank in the Battle of the Beachhead. In their first real test on French soil, they had come through in fine style.
Montgomery's tactical handling of the British and Canadians on the eastward flank involved the kind of work in which he excelled. The morale of his forces remained high, in spite of frustrations and losses that could easily have shaken troops under a commander in whom they did not place their implicit trust. Caen did not fall to our initial rush as we had hoped. The battling in that area reached a sustained and intensive pitch. Rommel defended tenaciously.
For weeks, the battle for Caen raged, but the Germans continued to hold on under Montgomery's heaviest assault. After a month of steady bombing and shelling, Caen finally was taken by Montgomery's men on July 9th. The community, or what was left of it, was liberated at last, and the townsfolk no longer moved about in the shadow of the Nazi conqueror. The younger inhabitants, who had been children when the Nazis swept through France in 1940, were especially happy to be liberated. After the capture of Caen by the British, the advance of Allied forces on all fronts was slowed down.
The battle for position and the building up reserves progressed at times with disappointing slowness. There always exists the problem of maintaining morale among fighting men while they are suffering losses and are meanwhile hearing their commanders criticized.
To offer a lift to morale, General Eisenhower personally decorated a number of GIs who had distinguished themselves in battle. The need for nourishing food and sufficient rest became matters of primary concern for even the most hardened combat soldiers. If they were to stay in good fighting trim, these needs had to be satisfied periodically, even though it meant that they would have to be pulled out of the lines in a tough campaign. Most effective morale builder for many GIs was a chance to renew their spiritual lives. To many GIs who had their faith to comfort them, even the prospect of death seemed easier to bear. Of course, there were moments which were not grim. In many of the liberated French towns and villages, the inhabitants were anxious to demonstrate their appreciation of deliverance from their Nazi conquerors. Meanwhile, a concentrated Allied attack was already overdue. The key point on the Allied offensive was the town of Saint-Lô, from which Allied commanders planned to break out in spite of strong enemy counteraction. The capture of Saint-Lô was a major step in breaking through the heavy layer of Nazi resistance.
The weather, which had been bad, grew abominably worse, and for the following week, all of us went through a period of agonizing tenseness. We had to draw plans to take advantage of the first favorable break in the weather. Finally, on July 25th, 7 weeks after D-Day, the attack was launched from the approximate line we had expected to hold on D+5, stretching from Caen through Caumont to Saint-Lô.
As expected, the Allies had a tough job on their hands.
Progress on the first day was slow, but it was always slow going in the early phases of such an attack.
With the Germans fighting desperately to contain them, Bradley's forces continued their punishing attack.
In the following week, he slashed his way downward to the base of the peninsula. With a clean and decisive breakout achieved, Bradley's immediate problem became that of inflicting on the enemy the greatest possible destruction.
The Allies drove almost due south through Oran. The First Army then turned eastward to hit the Germans' flank, but the enemy contested this action.
His attacks, which were thrown in at the town of Mortain, just east of Avranches, began on August 7th.
The weight of the Nazi assault was centered on a 5-mile front between Mortain and Sourdeval, which was defended by 2 American divisions. Throwing 6 somewhat battered tank divisions into the battle, the Nazis continued their counteroffensive for 3 days. Their gains were tiny, a matter of only a few miles, but they fanatically carried on their attack in spite of equally determined opposition. They used every available weapon in their sustained attack on our tanks and troops. They matched us weapon for weapon.